here we will continue our lesson on simultaneous change in demand and supply. But this time we will highlight on the market condition where the change in demand equals the change in supply. So what we can see from the presentation are the relationship, specifically when the change in demand equals to the change in supply. So I will just read these items to you, and then later on we will have it illustrated using the specific market situations through problem statement. So here, given that there exists increase in demand which equals increase in supply, the price equilibrium remains the same, but the quantity equilibrium increases. Number two, given that there exists increase in demand which equals decrease in supply, the price equilibrium increases, but the quantity equilibrium remains the same. Third, given there exists decrease in demand which equals increase in supply, the price equilibrium decreases, but the quantity equilibrium remains the same. And last, given that there exists decrease in demand which equals decrease in supply, the price equilibrium remains the same, but the quantity equilibrium decreases. We will illustrate these four relationships by analyzing the specific market condition as provided by the problem statement. Let us read the first problem statement. The original demand and supply equations are QD equals 72.5 minus 12.5p and QS is equal to negative 25 plus 15p respectively. Solve for the new price and quantity equilibrium given that that after a period of time there exists a simultaneous increase in demand by 10 units and increase in supply by 10 units also. So the fact that the change in demand by 10 units is also equal to the change in supply by 10 units, what will be its implication to the price equilibrium and quantity equilibrium? Because what we can observe here is that market forces between the demand and supply are in balance. So in order to determine the outcome of price equilibrium and quantity equilibrium, let us first derive the new demand equation and the new supply equations given their original demand and supply equations. So for the new demand equation, we add the change in demand, which is increase in demand by 10, okay, from the original demand equation of 72.5 minus 12.5p. So the new demand equation now is 72.5 minus 12.5p plus 10. And to simplify, it is now equal to 82.5 minus 12.5p. So that's the new demand equation. The new supply equation is also computed in the same way. We just have to add the change in supply from its original supply equation. And the change in supply is also increased by 10 units. So we will introduce the plus 10. And we add this to the original supply equation of negative 25 plus 15p. So that the new supply equation now is negative 25 plus 15p plus 10. And to simplify, the new supply equation now is equal to negative 15 plus 15p. So to derive the original price equilibrium, we equate the original supply equation to the original demand equation and solve for P. And our P now is equivalent to 3.54. 3.54 is now the value of our original price equilibrium. Now to solve for the new price equilibrium, we can derive the new price equilibrium by equating the new supply equation to the new demand equation. And so the new supply equation is given by 15 or negative 15 plus 15p. The new demand equation is given by 82.5 minus 12.5p. So equating these two, we now have minus 15 plus 15p equals 82.5 minus 12.5p. And so solving for p, we now have the value of 3.54. So the new price equilibrium now is 3.54. To specifically compute for the change in price equilibrium, we just deduct the original price equilibrium from the new price equilibrium. So the new price equilibrium is 3.54, and the original price equilibrium is 3.54. So the fact that their values are equal, we have a change in price equilibrium equal to 0. So 0 means constant. 0 means no change in the value of price equilibrium. So if we look at the curves, you'll notice that the gap between the supply curves is the same or as big as the gap between the demand curves. So that is to graphically illustrate that the change in demand is equal to the change in supply. And notice that finding for the equilibrium point original is between QD1 and QS1, and the new quantity equilibrium point, or the new equilibrium point, is between QD2 and QS2. So notice that their corresponding price equilibrium are the same. So that is to imply that the price equilibrium is constant. It did not change. But what has changed is the value of the price equilibrium. The price equilibrium actually increased from 28.25 to 38.25. That is because there is both increase in demand and increase in supply. And since the change in demand is directly related to quantity equilibrium, and also the change in supply is directly related to quantity equilibrium, when there exists simultaneous increase in both the demand and supply, quantity equilibrium will also increase. And we can prove this through the computation of quantity equilibrium in this next slide. So given the same situations and curves, look at the value of the new quantity equilibrium. The new quantity equilibrium is 38.25, while the original quantity equilibrium is 28.25. So there is actually a change by 10 units, and the change is positive because the new equilibrium is greater than the original quantity equilibrium. So the change in quantity equilibrium is Q E sub 2 minus Q E sub 1, which is 38.25 minus 28.25. So the change in quantity equilibrium is 10 units, and the sign is positive. Positive means increase. Notice again the movement of quantity equilibrium from 28.25 to 38.25, graphically speaking. Let us move on to the next slide. And in this next slide, still the same situation, the change in demand equals to the change in supply, but here there is already an opposite direction between the demand and supply. The demand increased, but the supply decreased. Earlier, both the demand and supply increased, but this time only the demand increased, but the supply decreased. So we expect the supply curve to shift to the left, while the demand curve shifts to the right. Notice also that graphically there is that same size of gap between the original supply curves and the original demand curve. I mean, the gap between the supply curves is the same as the gap between the demand curves. So the same procedure was done. That is, first from the given demand equation, we add the change in demand to derive the new demand equation. The fact that there is an increase in demand by 15 units, so we will introduce plus 15 as what is added to the original demand equation, which we refer to as QD sub 1. So that the new demand equation now, if we will simplify, will come out to be equal to 87.5 minus 12.5 P. And that is the same way we derive the new supply equation. The change in supply is added to the original supply equation. And since the original supply equation is negative 25 plus 15P, so we can now have the new supply equation as negative 25 plus 15P minus 15. So notice the minus 15 is introduced because there exists a decrease in supply by 15 units. So to simplify, the new supply equation now is negative 40 plus 15P. Okay. So, using the same way as to how we can solve for the price equilibrium based from previous computations, equating the new supply equation to the new demand equation will give us the value of the new price equilibrium. And the new price equilibrium now is 4.64. It means to say there is a change in price equilibrium by the amount of 1.10. And since the sign is positive, it means to say that there is an increase in price equilibrium by 10 units. So if you look at the graph, the price equilibrium was from 3.54 to now 4.64. So the price equilibrium actually increased. And such values of price equilibrium can be observed from the equilibrium point. The equilibrium point as the point of intersection between the original demand and supply curves. So we have QD sub 1 equals to QS sub 1, which corresponding value price equilibrium is 3.54, and corresponding value of quantity equilibrium is 28.25. So what you can observe from this graphical presentation is that there is no change in quantity equilibrium. Quantity equilibrium remains at 28.25, so no change in quantity equilibrium. What has changed is only the price equilibrium. Specifically, there is an increase in price equilibrium by 1.10 pesos. So, given the market situation that the increase in demand equals the decrease in supply, the price equilibrium increases, but the quantity equilibrium remains the same. So in the next slide, what is to be shown is the values of original and new quantity equilibrium. So given the same problem statement, okay, here we have this value of the original and new quantity equilibrium. The original quantity equilibrium is 28.25 or 29, and the new quantity equilibrium is 29.5 or 29. So it's a matter of decimal places difference, and due to our not using fraction, okay, that's why we have this difference in values by an insignificant amount, so that it's a matter of rounding off numbers. So that is to say, the original quantity equilibrium is not different significantly from the new quantity equilibrium. So graphically we can see that there is that same line between the original and new quantity equilibrium. Notice also that the gap between the original and new supply curves is the same or as big as the gap between the new and or rather same as the gap between the demand curves. Okay, so next is another situation, market situation, but specifically the decrease in demand here equals increase in supply. Earlier it was increase in demand equals decrease in supply, but this time decrease in demand equals increase in supply. So just the same procedure as what we have done in the previous slides. What we can just probably take note here are this size of gap. Okay, so notice that the size of gap between the supply curves is equal to the size of gap between the demand curves, and that is to illustrate that the change in demand equals the change in supply. the problem statement actually says that the original demand and supply equations are QD equal to 72.5 minus 12.5P. The QS is equal to negative 25 plus 15P respectively. Solve for the new price and quantity equilibrium given that after a time period, there exists a simultaneous decrease in demand by 8 units and increase in supply by 8 units also. So the amount of change in demand and the amount of change in supply are the same. One is increasing, the other is decreasing. But no matter whether the change is increase or decrease, the magnitude of change is what is of priority here. And the next is the direction of change. So if it is decrease in demand, then we will introduce negative sign to that particular amount of change. So we introduce negative 8 to the change in demand. Negative because there is a decrease in demand. So if the change in demand is added to the original demand equation, we can derive the new demand equation. So the new demand equation is QD sub 2 equals to 64.5 minus 12.5P. The new supply curve, which is equal to negative 17 plus 15P, is simply just the sum of the change in supply and original supply equation, because the change in supply is increase in supply by 8 units, so we introduce positive 8, and adding this to the original supply equation of negative 25 plus 15P. So we now have a simplified value of the equation, which we refer to as the new supply equation, which is equal to negative 17 plus 15P. And so for computing the new price equilibrium, the new price equilibrium is 2.96, and we derive this by equating the new supply equation to the new demand equation. The original price equilibrium of 3.54 was computed after we have equated the original supply equation to the original demand equation. So we can now solve for the change in price equilibrium. The change in price equilibrium is simply just new price equilibrium minus original price equilibrium. New price equilibrium is P sub 2 and original price equilibrium is P sub 1. So P sub 2 minus P sub 1 is equal to 2.96 minus 3.54, which will give us a difference of negative 0.58, which means that the amount of change in price equilibrium is 58 centavos, but this is directed downward because of the negative sign. So negative means decrease. So there is a decrease in price equilibrium by 58 centavos. And to solve for the corresponding change in quantity equilibrium, so it will require us to compute first the value of the new quantity equilibrium and the original quantity equilibrium. So same procedure was adopted. And to make the story short, we can notice here that since the new price equilibrium is equal to the original price, the new quantity equilibrium is equal to the new quantity, the original quantity equilibrium. I'll state since the new quantity equilibrium is equal to the original quantity equilibrium of 28, so there is no difference. That means to say the value is 0, and so the change in quantity equilibrium is 0, meaning that quantity equilibrium did not increase or decrease. It remains constant. So notice that graphically there is no change in quantity equilibrium, but there exists a decrease in price equilibrium from 3.54 to 7.96. Okay, here in this next slide is that there is both decrease in demand and supply, and the decrease in demand equals the decrease in supply. So how much is the decrease in demand? The decrease in demand is 8 units, and the increase in supply, or rather, yes, this is both decrease. So this is a typographical error to have not changed the word increase to decrease. So I will read again this particular problem statement and have it redefined. So notice here that the original demand and supply equations are QD equal to 72.5 minus 12.5 P, and QS is equal to negative 25 plus 12, or rather 15 P respectively. Solve for the new price and quantity equilibrium, given that after a time period there exists a simultaneous decrease in demand by 8 units and also decrease in supply by 8 units. So please change the word increase, the last word of increase from the problem statement, to a word decrease. So decrease in demand by 8 units and decrease in supply by 8 units also. So change the last word increase to decrease. Now, the procedure of finding for the new pricing for the new demand equation and the new supply equation are the same as what we have done in the previous slide. So let us not anymore highlight on this. What is clear to us now is that we have the new and original demand equations and new and original supply equations. Okay, the process of finding for price equilibrium, original and new, are the same as how we have solved it earlier, in the previous slides. But what is to be noticed here is the shift in the supply curve. The fact that there is both decrease in supply and decrease in demand. So both the supply and the demand curve shifted to the left. But notice the size of the gap. Notice that the size of the gap between supply curves is equal to the size of the gap between the demand curves. So that is to illustrate that the change in demand equals the change in supply. After finding for the original price equilibrium and new price equilibrium, we can observe that the values of the original price equilibrium and new price equilibrium are the same. They are both 3.54. So that means to say change in price equilibrium is 0 or constant. Okay, and you can notice it from the same line of the new price equilibrium and the original price equilibrium. Okay, the new price equilibrium is 3.54 and the new the original price equilibrium is 3.54 also. So what has changed is the quantity equilibrium. The quantity equilibrium actually decreased from 28.25 to 28.54. 28.25 to negative 20. Please make a correction. The new quantity equilibrium is 20 rather than 28.25. So 28.25 to 20. Why is this? Something is wrong with the values I have inputted as far as quantity equilibrium is concerned. So the original quantity equilibrium is 28.25, but the new quantity equilibrium is 20. Where is that point? Oh, sorry. Something is wrong with this gap. I have not. Okay. The original quantity equilibrium should be between the original demand equation and the original supply equation. So the location of the original equation is correct. That is, QD1 is equal to QS1 with a corresponding price equilibrium of 3.54 and quantity equilibrium of 28.25. But let us look at the location of the new equilibrium point. The new equilibrium point is supposed to be between the original or rather, the new equilibrium point is supposed to be point of intersection between the new supply equation and the original or the new demand equation. I have to. I failed to make a better illustration in this particular case. Maybe because of some. Okay. So the location of the new equilibrium point is actually correct there. It's only that I failed to move, the writing of QD sub 2 equals QS sub 2. It should be where that the QD sub 2 equals QS sub 2. But look at the value. The value of quantity equilibrium is actually to the left of 10. And, something is wrong here. Yes. So it should not be 20. It's rather a value of. Let me compute it again, because I have to revise what is stated in that particular diagram. So 52.5 minus 44.25 is 8.25. So please make a correction that the value of new quantity equilibrium is 8.25, which is actually correct in this particular computation. Change in quantity equilibrium is 8.25 minus 28.25. Okay. the new quantity equilibrium is 8.25, and the original quantity equilibrium is 28.25. So the amount of change in quantity equilibrium is negative 20, and that is correct. What is wrong is the concluding value in the computation of new quantity equilibrium, and what was written there is negative 20. It should not be negative 20. It should be negative 8.25. So please make a correction. That is why I found it confusing. No? So change the value of negative 20 as the value of new quantity equilibrium to a value of 8.25. Okay? So that's how we can work it out. So there is no more slide remaining, and that is how we can explain the illustrations given in this PowerPoint. So if some corrections are needed to be changed, please take note of it. As I have said, the computed value of new quantity equilibrium is not negative 20. It's a typographical error. It should be 8.25. And so graphically also, it changed 28.25, okay, corresponding to new equilibrium value, okay, on the graph. It was written there 28.20, supposedly 8.25, okay, so that the amount of change actually is negative 20. So change in quantity equilibrium is negative 20. Decrease by 20 units in quantity equilibrium. So to summarize, given that the decrease in demand equals the decrease in supply, the price equilibrium remains the same, but the quantity equilibrium decreases. So please take note also, there is that correction. Given that the decrease in demand equals the decrease in supply, the price